please let us know where you're joining from. Put us in the chat, say hi, and include your favorite emoji, if you will, so we can get things started in good high energy. So, to introduce myself, my name is Renata Alvarenga. I'm from Brazil and I'm actually calling in from Guatemala today. So, very early day and very excited to be starting the day with you for UN Day. And I'm actually representing the Next Generation Global Fellows for Planet. So, very excited to be here. And I'll pass to Ishan.
Hi everyone, I'm Ishan. It's great to join you, Renata, to co-moderate this amazing session. My name is Ishan. I'm currently joining you from New York, but usually based in London. I am the lead Next Generation Fellow and really would like to say Happy United Nations Day for 2025. Today marks 80 years since the UN Charter came into force. That's 80 years of cooperation, conflict, and constant reinvention.
Exactly, exactly. From the ashes of World War II, nations chose dialogue over destruction. And here we are, 8 decades later, a global family of 8 billion people asking what the UN has taught us, what it awaits us as we look to 2100. So, to set in the mood in the waiting room, if you were here just a couple minutes before, you have been able to see some historic images of the UN from this past 8 decades since its founding. And through the next hour that you'll be here with us, we'll move between past and future, learning, dreaming, and building together. So, to get us started, we'll do an interactive poll very quickly, just so we can get things going.
Awesome. So let's see how much our audience knows about the UN's origin story. So a quick poll should pop up on your screen with two questions. Question number one is, how many countries were present at the San Francisco conference in 1945? And the second question is, how many women were among those delegates?
Yes, take a guess. We encourage you to not Google or use ChatGPT, and we'll review the answers in a moment and maybe drop a surprise fact or two, some fun facts from UN history. So please do vote. We'll give it a little minute. All right, has everyone voted? Okay, I believe the poll has closed and we have the results. All right, so I see that 40% of you voted on 23 for question one on how many countries were present in the San Francisco conference. Second most voted answer was 50. Let's see for the second one, how many women were among those delegates. The winning answer here was none, 52% voted this. So let me get you to the results. So the correct answer for the first question on how many countries were there, it's actually 50. 50 nations and just 8 women delegates. Only one country actually sent 2 female delegates, which was Great Britain, and the rest just one, and they are Australia, my own country, Brazil, China, the Dominican Republic, and Uruguay. That's a huge reminder that our journey towards an inclusive multilateralism with gender equality at the forefront is still unfinished.
And that's why today's conversation really matters, connecting those who built the UN with those who are reimagining it for the next 80 years. And to begin, we'll reflect on what keeps us coming back to the table as nations and as people. Joining me are two incredible change makers, Mr. Temba Kalua, who leads the Pact for the Future implementation in the UN Secretary-General's office, and Prachi Shavgaonkar, a Next Generation India Fellow and lead author of Our Future Agenda India, a visionary youth-led roadmap for India at 100. So thank you so much, Prati and Tamba, two very good friends, for joining us today on this morning for UN Day 2025. It's great to have you here. Tamba, I would like to turn to you first. The UN has really just hit 80, and it is a big milestone. And you've been leading work on the Pact for the Future implementation. So for the audience who are watching today who might not know what that means, how does the Pact for the Future actually change the way that countries and communities work together today?
Thank you, Ishan. A very good morning from New York and warm UN Day greetings to you all. Yes, this milestone, UN turning 80, comes at a truly pivotal moment. The world is facing a convergence of crises, escalating conflicts, worsening climate impacts. Progress on the Sustainable Development Goals remains too slow, and technological change is outpacing our capacity to govern it responsibly. And for 8 decades, the United Nations has been the place where all nations come together to solve humanity's greatest challenges. But today, multilateralism itself is under strain. Multilateral institutions, including the United Nations, built decades ago to advance peace, development, human rights, must evolve if they are to meet the challenges of a rapidly changing world. And that's where and that's what the Pact for the Future is all about. Adopted by consensus by all UN member states, it is a blueprint for renewing global cooperation, making it more inclusive, accountable, and effective. The pact is aimed at accelerating delivery of existing commitments, such as the Sustainable Development Goals that most of us are familiar with, while tackling emerging and fast-evolving issues that require urgent global attention, such as artificial intelligence and digital governance. But at the heart of the pact is a promise, a commitment, a collective commitment to build a more just, peaceful, and sustainable world grounded in solidarity, equity, and responsibility to future generations. As you may be aware, it has got 2 annexes, a global digital compact, which sets out shared principles and actions for a safe, inclusive, and sustainable digital future for all, and declaration on future generations, which commits to embedding the rights and interests of those who will inherit the planet from us in our decision-making today. Now, you've asked an important question. In practical terms, what does this mean? The pact is already changing how countries work both at intergovernmental and country level. At an intergovernmental level, it has given new mandates and added momentum to specific issues. For example, member states recently agreed to establish 2 new global mechanisms for AI governance, comprising an independent scientific panel and a global dialogue. Many of you followed the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development that took place in Seville. The Seville commitment advances pact actions, especially in the areas of debt, concessional finance, and credit rating agencies in the context of the reform of the international financial architecture. Pact promises related to social development are reflected in the draft outcome of the World Social Summit that is taking place in a few days' time. At the country level, including in communities, UN teams across the world are working hand in hand with governments in partnership with civil society, young people, and other stakeholders to advance pact implementation in alignment with national priorities and SDG acceleration plans. So in short, Ashan, the Pact for the Future is helping the international community to move from words to action, renewing the promise of multilateralism for the next generation. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Sam. That's so energizing to hear. It's been just over a year since the pact has been adopted, and we're already seeing a lot of progress, not only at the international level, but as you mentioned, at the regional level and the country level too, which is great to see. And that's exactly the essence of the pact too. And so we're celebrating 80 years of the UN, but it's also 78 years of India's anniversary, with the biggest population in the world. So Prachi, how can global institutions like the UN better reflect the priorities of young countries like India?
Amazing. That's a great question. And as Temba said, good morning to all of you from New York. I must say good evening to all of you from India. It's a great coincidence that we are going to be sharing this milestone, India and United Nations. And I think the first time I, as a young person in India, started following the UN was when I was about 18 or 19, and I was developing an app for climate action for my community. And I got to know about the world leaders coming together at the UN General Assembly to discuss our future. And I remember at that time thinking the UN seemed so far away. It looked like a place only for world leaders and prime ministers and scientists. And I never thought a person like me could ever get to go there. Fast forward many years later, 3 years ago was the first time I got the chance to actually step into the UN. And it was a day I would never forget. And many of the people who made that day possible for me are actually on this call. So I was nominated by the UN Foundation to be a part of a special meeting with the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. And that was my first ever day stepping into the UN. Now, what was so different about that meeting was it was a one-way interaction in a way that we were talking, me and 15 other climate innovators, and he was listening and taking notes. And at the end of the meeting, he consolidated all of our recommendations, things we wanted to pass on to the world leaders. And he actually mentioned some of them in his report later on. And that really opened my eyes, because it made me think back to when I told my friends back home that I'm going to be going to the UN. They reacted as if I was going to the moon. And it made me realize that for young people like us, especially living in India, we feel going to the moon and going to the UN feels the same. You know, we look at the United Nations as if it is a unicorn who's going to magically solve all of our problems. But what we really need to do is look at it like a common horse that we all work towards, that we all hop on and work towards to a better future together. And so I think what would really make a difference is if we were able to work on making the United Nations more accessible, so that people don't feel like it is a faraway institution. People feel like we are a part of it. And the way to do that is, you know, through the very events that we are on right now. We are through the engine room of the future that we work on at the UN Foundation, which looks at how do we mobilize young people to make the UN, to plan for how the UN thinks and acts for our future. So many of these efforts have already started, and through these efforts, I hope that in the years to come, the UN feels like it is our place and not a distant place.
Thank you so much, Prachi, and thanks for bringing the personal element into it as well, and to humanize it with that story that you shared there, and also great points around shifting the narrative, right? How can we make the UN more accessible? How can the UN meet young people where they're at? And so we often talk about making the UN accessible, and we often use a lot of jargon and these big words that can sound very abstract. And Temba, the pact talks a lot about solidarity, about sustainability, and importantly about trust. And these are all big words that sound powerful, but they can feel abstract for young people. So what do they really mean in practice, and how will these ideas shape how the UN actually works right now and also in the years ahead?
That's a great question, and one we often hear, and it builds very nicely from the excellent intervention from Prachi. And you're right, words like solidarity, sustainability, and trust can sound abstract. But again, through the Pact for the Future, which I see as one of our biggest assets at the moment, they are being translated into very concrete changes in how we work and engage. So I want to give a few examples. But before I do that, I just want to mention that trust is built when people feel held, represented, and when we deliver on the promises already made. And the pact is precisely about that, promoting fair representation, especially when it comes to global governance, accelerating actions, like I mentioned earlier, on existing commitments, especially the SDGs, and across all regions, UN country teams are now implementing what we call high impact initiatives to help government fast track their implementation of SDG related initiatives. So this is one way of trying to support countries meet or deliver on the commitments that they've already made. And like I said, part of building trust is ensuring that we deliver on the commitments that we've made. But building on the points that Prachi mentioned, we are also seeing real change in how we engage different stakeholders. For example, young people are now more visible and active in key UN discussions, from high-level political forum, ECOSOC Youth Forum, to the General Assembly, where this year a dedicated high-level segment celebrated the 30th anniversary of the World Programme of Action for Youth. Civil society's role has also grown significantly. Their engagement was instrumental in shaping the pact itself. You may recall that last year, there was the Nairobi conference that brought together thousands of civil society, and civil society continues to play a meaningful role in the implementation phase. And today, we see more stakeholder events taking place alongside intergovernmental meetings than ever before, a clear signal of growing inclusivity and trust. But I also want to mention another key aspect of the pact, and that's one of these annexes, the Declaration of Future Generations. We're working to implement this, including in the UN, to ensure that we are fit for the future. We're increasing our capacities to drive futures thinking, including our ability to support member states upon request using tools such as strategic foresight. I see a number of countries that have joined this conversation, from Nigeria to Cameroon, India, of course, where this is already being put to practice. This is an area that enjoys a strong collaboration with many of the stakeholders, some of you who are part of this webinar, and it is great to hear examples that are happening across different countries, and hopefully we will hear a little bit more maybe from Prachi. We have just launched a new website specifically for the Path for the Future, where you can see all information packed related, from the background to what is included in the various chapters, what is included in the annexes, including a section where you can read about the progress that is being made in the implementation of the pact. This is a way of holding ourselves accountable as a UN system and showing how these principles are becoming a reality.
Thank you so much, Thamba. Thank you so much for demystifying those terminologies, and then for signposting the new website, which is a great resource and tool, and it's much more user-friendly as well. So it's great to have that resource available for young people in particular. And speaking of turning sort of abstract concepts into concrete action, we're really excited because the Our Future India report, sorry, is launching in a few days. And Prachi, you've been working on that quite a lot. And so from your experience working on the Our Future India report, what insights or ideas do you feel are most urgent for India and the UN to act on now?
Amazing. So this is a very milestone moment for us. The report that we've been working on for 2 years is about to be launched in 4 days. And I have a feeling that all of you on this call are very lucky for us. The fact that I told you about the report just now is going to be a successful launch after that. Sometimes all of us work in such different parts of the world, and yet we come to the same conclusions. And I say that because the key ideas and recommendations that came forth in the report were similar to what Themba just said. And he kind of gave a spoiler to it already without knowing about it. I'll talk about a little bit about the process and then the key idea that we came upon. Over the last 2 years, us, the Next Generation India Fellows, traveled across our country, speaking to young people from all sorts of backgrounds. And our intention was that we wanted to include voices in decision making that are often left unheard. And what we realized was that, it was an extremely defining process for us, because we got to hear from young people across India, and the recommendations that they came upon were extremely grounded. Many of them did not know about the jargon that we use in spaces like the UN, and yet they were living through the effects that we talk about here. To give you an example, we were trying to have consultations with them on issues like climate change and rapid urbanization. Now, a young girl living in a tribal village in Bhubaneswar did not know about the term climate change. But she said, when I was little, the forest was right at my doorstep. And as I grew up, I could see the forest moving further and further away from me. There was another young person who talked about how in his family, and usually in his village, it would happen that the family can afford to send only one brother out to the city to earn a livelihood and to get educated. He said, my brother went into the city and now his life looks completely different from mine. And we got to hear about so many such lived experiences of young people living at the grassroots. And one idea and one theme was the common factor across these experiences, which were that all of these disruptors of modern times and the decisions that we take about those disruptors, can we think about how it's affecting our lives and our futures? And so there was an underlying ask to include future thinking into governance, to include justice not just for present generations, but for the generations to come. And so one of the key recommendations in our report is a moonshot that we go for, which is the formation of a Ministry of Future Affairs, which protects the rights of the current and the future generations.
Thanks so much, Prachi, and what a great idea to have a ministry of future. That's a great sort of concept, and I hope that's something that can become a reality at the national level. Temba, you've sort of seen how young people have been the biggest champion and some of the loudest voices pushing for the Pact's vision. We saw it last year when the Pact was being formed, and we're seeing it today in terms of the implementation, not only on Chapter 4, which is on youth and future generations, but across the entire Pact. And you, in your previous role as resident coordinator, you have seen the power of young people. So how do you see the role of young people moving forward, not just inside the UN, but out in communities and cities and villages where the change really happens?
Thanks, Ishan. I want to start by recognizing the extraordinary contributions of young people across all regions who are driving change on today's most urgent challenges. And Prachi has just given us an example of how young people in India are engaging in the future generations agenda. But I also wanted to bring another striking example, which is the recent International Court of Justice ruling that countries can be held accountable for climate harm. This is an initiative originally led by Pacific Island students, and it shows what's possible when young people mobilize around a shared vision for justice and sustainability. And like you have mentioned, Ishan, young people were also at the heart of the process that led to the adoption of the Pact for the Future. From regional consultations that took place across all regions to the civil society conference in Nairobi, the action days that took place here in New York, especially the Youth Action Days, and different consultations that took place in different countries. I recall last year, ahead of the Summit of the Future, when I was resident coordinator in the Pacific, we brought together young people and they had a conversation and engaged on the issues which contributed to the outcome of the summit. So young people brought energy, creativity, and clarity of purpose. Their voices helped make the Pact more ambitious and more grounded in real world hopes and challenges. As you may be aware, Chapter 4 of the Pact explicitly recognizes youth as agents of positive change and key contributors to peace, sustainable development, and human rights. It calls for investing in young people's social and economic empowerment, protecting their human rights, and ensuring their meaningful participation in decision-making at all levels. Our colleagues here in the UN office are leading the way to turning these commitments into action through different deliverables that we are working on collectively as a UN system. There is a global youth investment platform, a UN youth fund, and core principles for meaningful youth participation. Notably, the working group that is working on this, led by the UN office, is the first to systematically include young people as members, proving that co-design with youth is not a rhetoric, but a reality. And I want to thank many of you, several of you who are part of this meeting, because I know you actively engaged in that working group. But let me also emphasize that youth are not confined to Chapter 4 of the Pact. Their voices and contributions cut across every chapter of the Pact, whether it's peace and security, digital cooperation, sustainable development. The Pact challenges all of us to ensure that young people are meaningfully involved. And my office, together with the UN Youth Office, are working closely to advocate for this. And we are fortunate, of course, because we have a Secretary-General that is really committed to empowering young people. And we are already seeing this in action, from youth delegates from Italy bringing the Pact to universities, to the African UN youth delegates developing a youth action toolkit for the Pact, to workshops across Europe, inspiring dialogues during the youth stocktake of the Pact at the High Level Week. So how can you continue to engage and contribute as young people? And it's great to see many of you as part of this webinar. And my advice to you is keep connecting, keep learning, keep mobilizing. Deepen your understanding of the Pact for the Future and its annexes, raise awareness in your communities, and hold institutions, including the United Nations, accountable for delivering on their promises. Again, the UN Youth Office here in New York is your first port of call for engagement on the Pact, but we look forward to continuing to strengthen this excellent partnership that we have with young people across the world as co-creators of a more just, inclusive, and sustainable world. Thank you, Ishan.
Thank you so much, Tamba. Keep connecting, keep learning, keep mobilizing. I love that formulation there. So thank you so much. And thank you for your leadership and your office's leadership and making sure young people are really embedded. So we have the Pact for the Future and we have Our Future India. And we're currently at UN at 80. But Prachi, looking ahead to when the UN turns 100, what kind of world do you hope our generation will have built? And more personally, what part do you want to play in it?
Wow, that's a great question. Um, when I was 18, I spent a few months traveling across my state, talking to young people about the question that you asked me, about our futures, what kind of a world we wanted to build. Very quickly, I realized that if I was talking to young people with economically challenged backgrounds, they could not think about the future of the world. And so I changed the question and I started asking them about their own futures. And I asked them a simple question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I noticed that there were three very common answers that I got. I noticed that the young people who were very attracted to making an impact wanted to become teachers because their teacher was the most impactful person they had seen. The young people were attracted to having a figure of who were attracted to becoming a figure of authority wanted to become police officers because that was the most powerful person they had ever seen. And the young people who were attracted to earning money wanted to become bus conductors because that was the richest person they had seen with all of that money in his box. And I realized that depending on the economic background of the young people I was speaking to, their vision of how far they could look into the future would change. Because I cannot worry about my future if I have to worry about how I'm going to get food on my plate today. I cannot worry about the future of my country if I'm worried about how I'm going to get shelter above my head tomorrow. I cannot worry about the future of the world if I'm worried about the future of my country. And so the world that I hope to build in the coming decades is a world where young people have the privilege of thinking about the future, where we're not just spectators, but we can play an active role in shaping the world. And most importantly, I hope we are able to build a future where young people can dream big and have a fair chance at having their dreams realized. That's the future I hope to build. And through the Next Generation India Fellowship, I hope we've played a small role in making that happen and will continue to do so.
Thank you so much, Prachi. Thank you so much, Tamba, for showing us what cooperation looks like when it's both global and grounded. The Pact for the Future and Our Future India reminds us that imagination isn't a luxury, it's a governance tool. And so now I would like to hand over to Renata for our intergenerational dialogue. So, Renata, over to you to welcome two visionary thinkers.
Thank you so much, Ishan, and thank you, Timba. Thank you, Prachi, for such an incredible panel. I'm definitely inspired. I hope you all are too on this UN Day, and please stick around. We have many more exciting things coming. So I'm super honored to lead this intergenerational dialogue that we're about to have, and welcome Dr. Thant Myint-U and Charlotte Bunch, two voices that are reminding us why the UN matters and how its founding vision can guide us into the future we want for 2100 and beyond. But before I introduce them, let me also just remind you that at the end of this call, we're actually going to have a special musical guest, a rising star from South Africa, performing his original song. So please stick around. It's going to be a really fun event, morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. So now it's my pleasure to share a few words about our speakers for this segment. First off, Dr. Thant Myint-U is a historian, author, and international affairs expert. He's a former UN official in peacekeeping and political affairs, and he's carrying forward the legacy of his grandfather, the third UN Secretary-General U Thant, through his writings on diplomacy and moral leadership. Welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you.
And welcome also to Ms. Charlotte Bunch, who's a pioneering feminist scholar and a global advocate for gender equality and human rights. She has helped shape the recognition of women's rights as human rights and also the landmark 1995 Beijing Platform for Action. So, as you can see, we have two incredible visionaries, incredible leaders that have been making change for so many years when it comes to the UN system and diplomacy overall. So, I have an opening questions to you both, which is the UN has been around nearly 8 decades, as we've been discussing today, as we're celebrating today. And it's seen all types of situations and, historical events, wars, peace deals, massive global change in all senses, I'd say. So looking back, I'd like to know what moments show to you how the UN has managed to evolve and stay relevant amid all these global changes. And from its founding values back in 1945, which do you think still holds strong today? Which of these values? And which of these values do you think need a rethink for our time? So I'm going to start with Dr. Thant. Please go ahead.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Renata. That's a very kind introduction. It's great to be with everyone on this 80th anniversary of the UN. I think the founding values, the purposes, principles of the UN are still today as relevant and important as ever. I mean, they're not sacred text. Maybe we should look at them and examine them and see what could change. But in many ways, I think it's an inspired text, and so much of what's there, both in that opening part of the UN Charter, but in the whole Charter, I think is something that we need to really value going ahead, especially at these times when the future in some ways seems uncertain. The world seems more unsettled. We're facing more wars around the world, and some of the global challenges appear even more complex than in the past. But I'd like to tell a story because I think we all think in terms of stories, and we go back to the UN in 1945 and think about that time. I would say a few things. I mean, one is that we have to respect, I think, the wisdom, the ambition of the men and women who were at San Francisco and the other founders of the UN over those initial years. And these were people who twice in their adult lifetimes had lived through 2 world wars that killed 80 million people, and who had just seen 2 cities destroyed by atomic bombs, and who had seen a Great Depression in between these 2 world wars. And they were committed to the idea that some other kind of international politics had to be possible. And what they wanted was not just a set of abstractions or ideas, but a practical machine that could actually make sure that we don't go back into the old kind of international politics and make sure that another world war doesn't happen again. Now, that didn't just happen in San Francisco. It was a result of decades of efforts by people in civil society, in many different organizations around the world, from the days of the League of Nations, even before, thinking and talking about a different kind of politics globally. But the thing that really transformed the UN, because a lot of the UN machinery became stuck because of the Cold War in the 1950s, the thing that really transformed the UN was the inclusion, the incorporation, the integration of dozens of countries from Africa and Asia who had fought long and hard for their own independence. And when they became independent in the 50s and 60s especially, they entered the UN, they embraced the Charter, they embraced these values because they knew they were consonant with their own values, their own anti-colonial struggles, and what they wanted in terms of a more equitable international system. And when they came into the UN, they worked with the Secretaries-General of the UN, who became, around that time, the world's preeminent diplomats, mediators, peacemakers. And as one of the very first things that my grandfather, for example, as UN Secretary-General in the 60s did, supported by civil society, supported by these Afro-Asian countries, as they call themselves at the UN, was he averted a nuclear war in the North, in the global North. He mediated the Cuban Missile Crisis and made sure that the world was able to de-escalate, the big powers were able to de-escalate and prevent a nuclear war as well. So I think that's the origin story of the UN. It's not just San Francisco, it's many different people from around the world coming together and making it an organization that was practical and effective. And I think we need to remember that as at a time when, listening to the previous panel, there's so many people, young people, who really want to commit to the UN and make it work. That's incredibly important. And I want to say that it's been done before, and they're part of a legacy that actually goes back more than 80 years.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that. That's so important to remember the history and the context, right? So that we don't repeat mistakes, and we also continue working towards what has worked in the past. So that's such an important intergenerational message that I think we need to hear more of, especially in the young movement and people that are rebuilding these structures. Thank you so much, Dr. Thant. And I'll now pass on to Mrs. Charlotte Bunch for your answer on what moments do you think the UN has shown how it's evolved, and what values are holding strong, and what values should be rethought of in these times.
Well, thank you very much, and happy UN Day to everyone. I'm really happy to be here and to think about the UN in its long history and this troubled moment in time that we are today. And I would like to agree with the previous speaker, Thant, that the principles still hold, but they must be reimagined in every generation or in every decade according to what's happening. So I think, for example, that the development in economic and social rights principles really have to be re-examined today in light of the fact that inequality in the world has actually grown in the last few years. And I think there was a moment when inequality was being brought down. And yet, what I think has been happening in the last decade is the growth of inequality. So we need to think about those principles and what do they mean today, just as we need to think about how climate change changes how we imagine our future and peace and security. Each of these needs rethinking. The one that I would talk about as a moment, and there are many moments, is to kind of when and where I enter myself. I entered the UN through the women's conferences that began in 1975 and went on through Beijing. But the one that I would point to as kind of showing the need for the UN to change and how it struggled to do that is the human rights principle. Because at the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, it was really an opportunity that the UN took to expand its understanding of human rights beyond the divisions that the Cold War had. And I think the amazing work, which is symbolized by the Vienna Conference on Human Rights in 1993, but was really the work of the UN and civil society throughout that decade, was to expand our vision of human rights and to break down the Cold War barriers between social, political, and economic rights, so that we no longer thought about these as different generations that different people thought were important, but saw how they were interconnected, and particularly how you really couldn't have your full political rights without social and economic rights. And you don't really have your full rights if you have social and economic rights, but no rights, no civil and political rights, that these have to be interconnected. And for me, that took the place in Vienna in particular, of course, as you mentioned, in the bringing of women's rights into human rights, and where I saw the UN once accepting that, in fact, it had not had what we would call a gendered or a feminist lens on human rights, and had defined rights primarily from the perspective of what men experience in public life, and began to take on the question of major issues of rights in other areas. We saw the creativity of the UN and its ability to start to appoint mechanisms and to look at areas of rights like violence against women that had never been talked about before. And I think that showed its ability to expand the parameters of where we were, and it enabled what I'll probably talk about later, which is the expansion of the relevance of the human rights to the so-called private sphere of life, so that many people who didn't see the UN as having anything to do with their daily life began to realize how the human rights was part of the values that all of us work for and need to live by. I would say we have a similar challenge today around the climate crisis. And I won't go into the details, but I think we have to look at human rights and development and how these must be reinterpreted in light of the climate crisis.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you so much. And I'm glad you mentioned the climate crisis. It's what I work in. And I think these interconnections that you mentioned of how human rights is interconnected with everything, with peace, with climate action, is so necessary, right? We can no longer work on these different problems in silos. And these anniversaries that you mentioned, or these key dates, such as, for example, this year, the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, I think are so important for us to look back and hear from people that were actually there, right? And were a part of how this came about. So inspired by you both. Thank you so much for bringing those thoughts and inspirations and reflections. And just before I go to my next few questions, I want to remind everyone that we will have a live Q&A. So definitely post on the chat any questions that you have for the current speakers. I'm sure there's many, so we'll curate and hopefully answer a few of them. But now I'll continue with just my last few questions. Firstly, to Dr. Thant, back to Dr. Thant. I wanted to ask you about your grandfather, as you've mentioned already in your first statements. You've grown up with a front row view, I'd say, of history through your grandfather's legacy as UN Secretary-General, which I can only imagine how special that is. So I'd love to hear from you what lessons from his leadership, especially his calm, principled style of diplomacy, as we know, feel most relevant in today's world, especially with all the growing tension and noise that we see around the planet. Let us know.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for that question, Renata. I mean, I was very, very young when he was Secretary General, so I have hazy sort of memories of him as my grandfather. Never had a chance to discuss with him Middle East diplomacy or the Cuban Missile Crisis or anything else. But I think where, in researching, I just wrote a book about his time at the UN, and in researching that, what really struck me was there was this time, as I mentioned before, when these newly independent states of Asia and Africa had come into the UN, made it their own, put one of their own at the helm of the UN, and the UN actually worked really well. And he was mediating over a dozen different conflicts around the world, preventing wars as well as ending wars in a very practical, pragmatic way, not just kind of talking about it, but actually doing it. The India-Pakistan War of '65, for example, being very much engaged in trying to end the Vietnam War throughout the 1960s. And I think he had a calm temperament. I think that was very important. I think even more important was that he was a risk taker, that he had political courage, that he, even when he didn't have a mandate from the Security Council, knew that what was more important was trying to prevent or end a war rather than his own personal reputation or even the reputation of the UN. And so I think that risk-taking element was extremely important. And I think as well, he had to have a moral imagination. I think all the best secretaries general have this. You have to be able to listen to people from around the world, understand every point of view, and then look for, again, the practical ways in which the UN can help to identify the right kind of principled compromise that can walk us back from war and towards peace. And I think now we should be as worried as ever before about another great war. We should be worried about nuclear war. We see more wars around the world now than ever before. The UN was set up exactly to prevent war. So I think not having, in the same ways in the 50s and 60s, this UN diplomat, Secretary General, who's able to speak to all the world leaders all the time and look to see where the UN can be most helpful in peacemaking. I think that's something that we need to value and to keep and to restore as well.
Thanks so much. Those lessons are so important, especially as you said, learning from the past and bringing that into all these changes in the current world. So thank you for this very, very special reflection. I'll pass it on to Charlotte. As you've discussed already, women have helped shape the UN from the very beginning, yet their leadership still doesn't get the spotlight that it deserves. So as a feminist myself, I'm also super excited to hear from you in your reflection about how feminist movements, past and present, have pushed the UN to think bigger about justice, equality, and the kind of world that it stands for.
Thank you again for this very challenging question. I think those first 8 women who were in San Francisco and the women who helped to draft the human rights declarations in the beginning were expanding the moral mandate to try to include all people. For me, in English, the change that the Charter and the declarations use from the rights of man to the rights of all people, to the rights of everyone, regardless of male or female, is the beginning step toward understanding what it means to include all people, in this case, male, female, but also I think the challenge to understand that the UN has to stand for equality and rights for every individual in every society. And this, of course, is a very huge mandate. But I think that the way in which women organized in that first round in San Francisco to get this declaration to no longer be just the rights of man in most languages, perhaps not in French, but in most others, was very important to symbolically show that we are not assuming anything about any group. This has been followed by enormous number of efforts that women have been involved in. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was, of course, involved in the founding both of the League of Nations and in the United Nations as a voice of the relationship between women and peace and the importance of peace to women. I think that's been further developed by the work that's been done by women on issues of rape and sexual violence and conflict as an illustration of what are the gendered aspects. I think this also includes recognizing sexual violence against men, which is often a dimension of torture and war that we don't talk about because it has been primarily a women's issue. And for women to bring a moral mandate means seeing what happens to us, but also seeing how those things have been invisible because they were considered private or individual, and beginning to bring the dynamic of violence and domination into the public analysis, and to see, as many people would say, that the violence and domination that's allowed in the home is the underpinning to the violence of racial and ethnic conflict and war, because it is the first lesson that children get, that one person has the right to control another or to violate and beat another. There are many different forms of control that can take. And so I think when women talk about equality or talk about these issues, it's important that we don't just think of them as only affecting women, but how these issues actually have supported a system that the UN is set up to change. You just mentioned, and I totally agree, we have so many wars today and so many conflicts, and they are a continuation of this belief that might makes right, that somehow you can still win by being the dominant person. And they aren't always just about ethnic conflicts. There's also, of course, economic violence that many people endure, especially where they are workers without any rights or where they are subjected. So I think women have tried to expand the moral mandate in the effort to be included ourselves first. And there's a long history of that. And there's a UN Foundation project that I've worked with trying to show the history of the global women's movements to the United Nations. And it's really quite an amazing project. And it's available from the UN Foundation website. What we've tried to show is that expanding that to include women is about expanding it to understand the diversity of situations that people live in and how many have been left out. Of course, the first exclusion was also what you've already spoken to, which was of the colonized Asian and African countries who weren't even able to speak for themselves in the beginning of the UN. But as that has been remedied, we still have other forms of inequality and exclusion that need to be addressed. And I think women have a particular desire and sensitivity to see the UN include these and to understand that they are often at the root of war. That is, these inequalities and these desires to dominate often lead to the very conflicts that the UN has, I think, a primary commitment to try to end in the world. So to me, it's bringing those, what were once seen as private, together with the public forms of violation and domination in order to include a greater variety of situations that we can address.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for bringing such important reflections that are very needed at this time that 80 years in, we need to rethink where do we go from here, right? What types of reforms, what type of world do we want to have? And learning from the past, learning from these lessons is so, so important. So thank you both. I do want to get to the live Q&A. Unfortunately, we won't have time to get through all these incredible questions that I'm seeing coming in the chat, but hopefully there can be some interaction there. So get to one and then pass on to Dr. Thant and then to Charlotte to answer both, hopefully in around 1 to 2 minutes, if you're able, which I know is difficult. These questions are kind of really big, right? We're talking about big changes, reforms, lessons from the past. So really, really appreciate you sharing all those lessons and your reflections from your incredible work experience. So I have this question from Sona, Brianna, and Mel, which says, what mindset should we build to stay resilient in a turbulent world? And what big shifts do you see coming for the UN in the next decades? And how do you see peace and justice central to these efforts? So basically, for the future, right? For the next decade, what shifts should happen? How do we stay resilient? And how do we incorporate peace and justice, which you both have mentioned, as key parts of what needs to happen? So perhaps, Dr. Tan, can I start with you to answer this?
Sure. It's a big question. I'm not sure I
Glad
can
you
I
get
can
it first.
really answer with just, give it full justice in a couple of minutes. But I would just, first say again, I think we do have to worry about the state of the world in terms of war, in terms of violence, in so many different ways. But also in terms of the kind of interstate violence that we thought at some point in the recent decades might have been behind us. And now we see a resurgence. And we see a resurgence of a kind of thinking that I think goes against the very ideals of the UN in 1945 and afterwards as well, which is that the only answer is militarization, military alliances, entering into military pacts, thinking about strategic threats, thinking about balance of power, all of that kind of thing. People thinking that's natural and inevitable. And I think it's that kind of mentality that needs to be fought against, not just in the abstract, but through history and through showing the kinds of ways in which the UN project over these 80 years has had many successes as well. I think that's really important. I think restoring again the UN's primacy in that peacemaking role. As we know, there are different people who call themselves peacemakers today. Some may be more successful than others. But I think we need to think about the wars that we have today, the wars that we might have in the coming 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and how exactly the UN can be reconfigured, its capacity added to, reimagined in different ways to prevent wars and to end the wars that we have right now. I think that's number one. I think, as we know and we've discussed, there's a whole range of issues. Climate change is one of the very top, if not the top, where they're not just important in themselves, but I think global cooperation on these issues also helps to create a different kind of environment, a different kind of thinking about a different world that's possible. So I think it's directly linked to peace and security, even in terms of just creating that right sort of set of dynamics between countries when we have cooperation on these kinds of issues. I think, lastly, I would just say, we also have to be realistic. It's not just an abstract thing. We have 80 years of history to look back on. We should think very carefully about what the UN is actually really good at and what it's not so good at, and not let the UN crowd out every space where maybe civil society, maybe ad hoc coalitions, maybe other ways of working can also be really important, if not central.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tan. Very important reflections. Charlotte, pass it on to you.
Well, I agree with everything Dr. Thant has said, and particularly your last point that I think we do need to be thinking when we think about the UN today, about what are really the key places where the UN is needed and not expecting it to do everything. And I think we know that the UN is in a budget crisis. Hopefully that won't be just determined by money, but we're able to really look at what is the unique role that we need the UN to play, because I myself would not like to live in a world without the UN, because I think that role is still important, even when many states, we have to admit, and I live in one of them normally, really don't think they have to be mindful of those international laws and standards in many cases. And I think it's important to do that. I also think it's important because, Sonia, you said what mindset. I think the first important mindset, which is what I do when I'm teaching my students, is you can make a difference. We have to believe that what we do can make a difference. It may not always make the difference you want it to, and it may not always make as much difference as you want, but what each individual does with our lives does make a difference. And I think particularly in this time of crisis, I would really encourage young people, no matter what your profession, to think about how you can contribute through that profession to the larger dynamics that we're discussing, because there's no area where these dynamics of how you solve conflicts, which is really what I say when I say the dynamic of domination, the notion that somebody can always be on top. These are fundamentally kind of soaked in our soil, and I don't think they're inevitable. I agree with you. I don't think I work on violence against women. I'm always saying there's nothing inevitable about it. There's nothing inevitable about war. We allow these things to happen because we accept that people have the right to dominate other people, and nations are built around that idea. And I think each of us has to fight that attitude in our daily life as a part of trying to make a difference in the world. And absolutely move your ideas into the public sphere. Again, I say this particularly for women, because women are doing it more today, but still not enough. We have, there's nobody who knows a lot more than you and has all the answers. You're part of the answer. Everyone's experience is part of the answer. So we often find that women are intimidated to enter the UN space, but we are needed too. We are all needed, and all our diversity, our definitions of what can happen will be held back by not having the voices of indigenous peoples, of peoples of very different experience in relation to violence, climate crisis, all the rest. So my first mindset is do it. Jump in wherever you are, jump in, but don't jump in as if you have the answers. Jump in with your experience and listen carefully to people who are different, and then find where you can connect. Of course, that means deciding what skills you want to get. Deciding on skills and strategies is connected to becoming engaged and involved in seeing what skills and strategies you need and you can bring to the table.
Thank you so much. Wow, that's a very inspiring message for us to take, that we are all part of the change, right? Everyone can make a difference. Everyone can be a part of it. So really, really appreciate that. Thank you, Charlotte. And thank you, Dr. Tan. Thank you both. I could be here for hours talking to you and just learning from you. I think we need to have more of these, right? These intergenerational dialogues. So really, really thankful for your time, and thank you for all the questions that came in. Unfortunately, we won't have time to get to them all, so we'll end the panel here and move on to the next part. But thank you all both so much.
Thank you.
So now, very quickly, we have this very fun exercise, which is a word cloud. After you've heard from these two sessions, right, all these incredible experts, we want to hear from you. So in the screen, you will see a word cloud prompt, which says, what is the biggest challenge that the UN should prioritize in the next 80 years, right? We've come so far to 80 years. So what about the next 80? So you can scan this QR code, join the link for the World Cloud, type a one-word answer, anything from climate to trust to AI, something we haven't spoken about here today, and we'll watch the word cloud grow in real time. But in this segment, I really do want to recognize and acknowledge someone that's here, Selamawit Tezera Chaka, who's my fellow, next generation fellow on peace at the Our Future Agenda. Selamawit is joining us from Ethiopia, and I was really looking forward to moderating this event with her, but unfortunately, internet issues got in the way, which is a reminder that access, even to virtual spaces, continues to be challenging for many young people around the world. But Selam, we're so happy that you're here so we can close this event together.
Thank you, Renata, and hello everyone. Happy United Nations Day 2025. It's great to be part of this conversation and to hear directly from all of you. So go ahead, share your words. What do you believe is the biggest challenge the UN should focus on the next 80 years? Let's see what our collective voice looks like.
We have lots coming in. Peace, which showed up in a lot of the panels, climate change, technological progress. Very interesting. Great. Children's rights, equality, conflict prevention. Okay, many important points. And I think it just goes to show that the intersectionality aspect of it is so important, right, Salam? We need to work at all these
Yes,
issues together.
pretty much, yes. Even economic stability and peace and climate has a biggest vote here.
Exactly, exactly. Well, thanks everyone for contributing. It's always so great to hear from you. I know that the online setting is not often the best one to connect, but hopefully this is also a way for us to keep hearing from you all. So thank you so much for participating, for joining this word cloud. And from here, we turn on to our final segments.
Thank you, Renata. Before we close, we're honored to welcome Zanoxolo from South Africa, a youth activist, a community leader whose words reminds us that every generation can be the one that chooses peace. Zanoxolo is a South African policy integration specialist, impact professional, and musician whose work bridge art, governance, and social impact. He was Mail and Guardian top 200 youth South African and former parliamentarian candidate. He advocates for youth leadership, democracy, and inclusive governance. Zanoxolo, we're so excited to have you close our UN Day celebration UN Day celebration. You have tracked everything from youth unemployment to peace building, and even run for parliament, which is very much exciting. What made you step up and take that leap into leadership? And what would you say to other young people who want to lead change, not just wait for it? Zanoxolo, over to you. I think you're muted. I cannot hear your voice. Still no voice, Zanoxolo? So I think we're working on it. Oh yeah, you're back now. Yes, I can hear you well.
Yes, yes. Thank you guys for having me. It's such an honor to be celebrating UN 80th today. And to just answer your question, I think for me, it wasn't an active choice that I made. It just came from a lot of frustration around the issues in our country and not seeing any change. And I just decided that I will not sit on the sideline to just watch everything happen to us and have those situations being imposed on us. You know, so I decided that if anyone's going to change the world, I should not look to the next person. I should start the change where I am. So that's what led the movement inside of me. That's why I decided to venture into policy making, into politics, and also to run for parliament. Yeah.
That's pretty much interesting, Zanoxolo. So as the UN celebrates 18 years, Africa, which is the world's youngest continent, has so much to teach the world. What lesson do you think global leaders can learn from African youth about staying resilient, building inclusive communities, and shaping a future built on real cooperation?
Can you repeat the last part of your question? I didn't quite catch that.
So the question is, what lesson do think global leaders can learn from African youth about staying resilient, building inclusive communities, and shaping a future built on real cooperation?
I actually think there's so much that we can learn from African youth. Quite recently, I'm seeing a lot of youth movements, and I think other young people that are still idle and not taking part in political action or in decision making in their countries should actually step up. We've seen a lot of resilience, especially I want to make a note of the youth or the Gen Z in Kenya that marched against the tax bill and makes those decisions to be overturned. So I think it's those kind of examples that show us that there's so much resilience and also there's so much power that the youth have in decision making and in defining the politics of the country. So I think those are the lessons that the UN should be taking, and also the rest of the world should be taking from African youth. Yeah.
Thank you so much for highlighting examples and how the youth have so much power in their hands to actually influence governance and policy. So, and finally, you're wrapping up today's celebration with live performance. And truly, we cannot wait to hear from you and your music as well. So tell us a bit about what inspired the piece and the message you hope people watching around the world will take away from your performance or from it.
Okay, so the song is titled Better, and I specifically wrote it for the United Nations. And when I wrote it, it's inspired by the theme of where to from here, celebrating and acknowledging where we've come and how far we've come, but also to try and imagine a future for us or for the South Africans, for the worldwide, globally. What we envision the future to be, right? So it speaks a lot about it being better, and also it does speak about no wars, no blood, that's the type of future that we imagine. Imagine a climate safe zone, a peaceful society, and I think it's a goal that is not far-fetched, and it's something that we really imagine. So that's what the song speaks about. And I think music has a powerful way of bringing us together and also echoing spiritual sentiments regardless of religion. I think what we can all agree is that we want better for us now, we want better for the future, we want better for our future generations and kids to come. Yeah.
Thank you, Zanoxolo, for answering my question. So over to your performance.
Hi everyone, my name is Zanoxolo King, and today is the 24th of October 2025, which is UN Day. UN is celebrating 80 years since inception and the UN Charter, and they've invited me to write a song and to sing the song live. The song is called Better, and it just speaks about what I envision the future of governance and political systems and the world to be. So please enjoy the song. I'm so excited for you to hear it.
What we ask, what we need is a better place to house all our dreams and our hopes, better people to trust and to hold. All we ask for is better. They'll talk it out, they'll hear us out, they'll hold our hands, they'll walk with us, yeah. That's the better we want. All we ask for is better. What we ask, what we need is a better place to house all our dreams and our hopes, better people to trust and to hold. All we ask for is better. and the world is better. There's no war, no blood, just peace. Yes, I imagine. Yes, I imagine that the world is better. What we really need, oh, better. What we really need is better. That's all we need, oh, better. The world is better. What we really need is better, oh, better. That's all we really need is better. All we need is better. That's all we need. The world is better. All we ask for is better. All we really need is better. That's all we really need, better, better. Oh, the world is better. All the world needs now is better, yeah. What we really need is better. That's all we need, oh. The world is better.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Zanoxolo, for this beautiful song. We're so honored, we're so thankful that we can end this celebration of UN Day with this beautiful performance. So thank you so much again. I acknowledge that there may have been some tech issues on our end. So we look forward to recording the Zanoxolo song and sharing it with everyone after this. So really, really thank you. Sending you a lots of applause all the way from Guatemala, and I'm sure everyone around the world is as well. And thank you to everyone that's joined us today. We know it was a packed agenda, but hopefully very exciting for you as we celebrate 80 years of the United Nations. May we ask each other and ask ourselves, what future are we building and for whom?
Yes, Renata. On behalf of the Our Future Agenda team and the UN Foundation, happy UN Day, and keep the conversation going on Discord. Share your reflection and thank you message to our speakers as well. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Happy UN Day.
Happy UN Day, everyone. Have a great day.